Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez coming to you from Baltimore. In Paris, COP21, or what we here at the Real News is now calling COP Out 21, is on its 10th day now. Today, another draft of the agreement was released, and you will find our review of the previous draft with Dimitri on our site under the Global Warning tab. That's right, Global Warning tab. And today, Dimitri is going to be talking about something quite different, which is Canada. But we will review the latest draft that was released today, tomorrow morning with Dimitri, and we'll have that available for you. But today, with us again is Dimitri Lascaris, and he's going to take a closer look at Canada's presence. Dimitri is a good person to do that because when he's not doing this, he is a plaintiff side class action lawyer with Siskins in Canada, and he ran as a candidate for the Green Party, and he's also a serving member of the Real News Network board. Thank you so much for joining us again, Dimitri.
Hi, Sharmini.
So, Dimitri, the Environment Minister of Canada, Catherine McKenna, who is the chief negotiator for Canada at COP21, well, I understand she held a press conference and you managed to get a question in.
Yes, it's been quite a challenge doing that. What I've learned the hard way is that Western countries leaders of Western countries like to take questions from the corporate media, and they tend to be quite, the people who make the decisions as to who's going to answer what question or ask questions tend to be quite close to certain members of the media, and it's not easy for persons from the independent media to get in a question, but today I was gratified to be given that opportunity.
Let's have a look at that.
Dimitri Lascaris for the Real News Network here.
Okay, sorry.
This is for Minister McKenna. The science is quite clear that in order to avoid warming in excess of 2 degrees Celsius, the vast majority of fossil fuel reserves will have to be left in the ground. Your government has embraced the 1.5 limit, which implies that an even greater proportion of fossil fuel reserves would have to be left in the ground. And my question to you, Minister, is how is the government's apparent support for the construction of the Energy East pipeline consistent with the scientific reality?
So, as we've said before, we're going to be working with the provinces and territories. We are committed to moving to a low-carbon economy, and we need to look at what that means. But, we're doing this with the provinces and territories. In terms of environmental assessments, we are reviewing environmental assessments, and that the Energy East pipeline, is part of that. But I think that, you can't, I don't like just, looking at one particular development. I think that we are looking at how we are going to make progress to a low-carbon economy. We're going to be working with the provinces and territories. And what's very encouraging is that we've seen the provinces and territories make many announcements, including here in Paris, about how they want to tackle climate change. So we are going to be looking at a whole range of solutions so that we reduce our emissions, so that we have an ambitious pan-Canadian plan to do our part.
I understand you didn't get a follow-up question, and sadly she didn't answer your question. What did you make of her answer?
Well, I think perhaps the most significant part of her answer is what she didn't say. She did not contest, nor could she do it with, I think, any credibility, but, this would not have stopped the predecessor, the Harper government. Credibility was never really an issue with them when it came to climate change. She did not contest my characterization of the science. It's very important. So, she had ample opportunity to do that. She could have said, well, I think the science is ambiguous. It isn't, by the way, but she could have said that. She could have said, I'm still digesting the literature. I'm new to my job. I need to be briefed, which is something that she actually did say to me when I crossed paths with her on the way back from the climate welcome. Or she just could have flatly contradicted what I said. She did none of those things. She was completely silent with respect to the scientific proposition that I put to her, which is that the vast majority of the fossil fuels have to be left in the ground, and that if you support the lower temperature threshold of 1.5 degrees as opposed to 2 degrees Celsius, the proportion of fossil fuels that must be left in the ground is even higher. So this is very important. Now, what did she say? it was very hard to really take anything concrete from it. It was like a series of ambiguous talking points. But she seems to be saying that, she talked about doing it in a responsible way. I think what she was referring to there was in a way that's not going to do damage to the Canadian economy, although she didn't quite use those words. She talked about a range of solutions. She talked about the cooperation of the provinces. Ultimately, however, if you're not going to contest the science, the oil must remain in the ground if you're going to actually comply with your stated objective of keeping the temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius, or as the government of Canada is now doing, saying it should be below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The only way that you could keep the temperature below that level, or make your contribution to keeping that temperature below that level, whatever it may be, 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, while continuing to burn fossil fuels from the tar sands or some other source, is by taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's the only way. The problem is that the technologies that are sometimes bandied about as a way of doing that, and in Canada, the one that's talked about the most is carbon capture, are unproven technologies. And in fact, this is something that Pablo Solon, the former Bolivian ambassador to the United Nations, said to me today when I interviewed him. And many others have said it, and scientists have said it repeatedly. And I think the Canadian government, if they're pushed, they'll have to say the same thing. These technologies for removing CO2 from the atmosphere are unproven. As long as they are unproven and they cannot be done on a large scale, then you've got to keep the fossil fuels in the ground to maintain that target. You can talk about range of solutions all you want and cooperation from the provinces all you want, but you can't escape that reality. And she really has no answer for the science. That was what was painfully clear from what she had to say. And sooner or later, it's going to become to Jesus time. Now people, I think, are cutting her some slack because the government came to power on November 9th. Some 4 weeks later, they're having to make these decisions at COP21, a decisive climate conference. They keep saying we're going to go home and we're going to work with the provinces and Indigenous peoples to come up with a pan-Canadian solution, as she did. Well, sooner or later, it's going to become apparent that there is no way for this government to respect its stated commitment to keeping the temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius without keeping the fossil fuels in the ground. And it's just a matter of time before that reality becomes painfully apparent.
Dimitri, I know that some of your colleagues in the room also got to ask a few questions that you thought was worthy of our audience. So what we're going to do is we're going to break now, and we're going to come back with those questions that two other media outlets posed to her and what her answers are. We'll be right back.